The ship that carried Eliot Vance to Solveth Prime was called the Meridian Clause, which sounded less like a vessel and more like a subsection of an insurance policy. An impression that was not improved by the interior decor, which ran heavily toward beige paneling and motivational placards about cross-cultural synergy. He had spent 11 days aboard it, sleeping in a bunk that was 3 centimeters too short for him, eating reconstituted protein that the ship's menu described as Earth-adjacent cuisine, and reading, with increasing unease, the imperial briefing documents that the Solveth embassy had forwarded to his tablet before departure. The documents were thorough. They were, in fact, so thorough that they had cycled back around to being unhelpful, the way a map becomes useless when it tries to label every blade of grass. He knew the Solveth governance structure to 7 tiers of bureaucratic depth. He knew the acceptable conversational distance between an off-world consultant and a member of the imperial household, 1 meter, 8 centimeters, which his tablet had helpfully illustrated with a diagram that made him feel like a piece of furniture being installed. He knew the 17 food items he was not to consume in the presence of nobility, 3 of which he had never heard of, and one of which was, bafflingly, a specific preparation of lentils. What the documents did not adequately prepare him for was the planet itself. Solveth Prime from the descent window looked like someone had taken a fever dream about architecture and given it a geological budget. The cities rose in formations that were less built than grown towers that curved into each other at impossible angles, bridges that arched between structures with the casual confidence of things that had never been told about gravity, canals running between it, all in long bioluminescent threads that pulsed slowly in the early morning dark like the planet was breathing. Eliot pressed his forehead against the cold viewport glass and thought, well, his previous postings had included a decommissioned water reclamation facility on Europa and a prefabricated research dome on Mars where the heating broke every February. He had a reasonably broad definition of remarkable. Solveth Prime revised it considerably. The agricultural complex where he was assigned sat on the eastern reach of the capital, separated from the main palace district by a wide canal and what appeared to be an extremely formal garden, the kind that looked as though the plants themselves had been briefed on behavioral expectations. His greenhouse was on the 3rd terrace, a long glass and alloy structure filled with the particular warm hum of climate control working overtime. When the imperial liaison, a tall Solveth man named Corvith of the 2nd Delegation, whose title Eliot immediately shortened, mentally, to just Corvith, showed him through the door, Eliot's shoulders dropped about 2 inches. He had been told to bring his own seeds. He had brought, in a temperature-regulated case that he had not let out of his carry-on for 11 days, a selection that covered the practical and the personal root vegetables adapted for low-gravity soil conditions, 2 varieties of experimental nitrogen-fixing legumes developed at the Callisto Agricultural Institute, and tucked in the lower compartment with the care of a man transporting small, irreplaceable things, 12 packets of earth strawberries. Corvith looked at the case with the polite incomprehension of a man encountering a religious practice he has not been briefed on. "These are seeds," Eliot said, which was not the most illuminating sentence he'd ever produced. "We have seeds," Corvith replied, with the diplomatic evenness of someone who was paid to be tactful about things he found puzzling. "Not these seeds," Eliot said. The previous 7 consultants, as best as Eliot could reconstruct from the briefing documents and from the careful silences of the staff when he asked questions, had approached Solveth Prime's agricultural crisis with the confident certainty of people who believed that problems were basically the same everywhere and mostly required the right methodology applied with enough authority. The northern continent's soil had been refusing grain crops for 2 generations. The Solveth had tried 47 introduced species. They had tried soil amendment programs of considerable technological sophistication. They had tried, at some point that the documents mentioned only briefly and without elaboration, a sonic intervention which Eliot chose not to think about too hard. Nothing held. The crops established, grew to perhaps 60% of viable development, and then stopped, not died exactly, just stopped, as though they had decided that this was sufficient and they were not prepared to commit further. Eliot had a theory. His theories were, historically, either very right or very wrong, and he had learned over the years that the only way to find out which was to get his hands into the soil and stop theorizing. He unpacked the UV lamps first. They were his own. The Imperial lab had lighting, but not the specific spectrum ratios he wanted, and he had discovered on Mars that arguing with facility managers about grow light wavelengths was an endeavor that consumed time he would rather spend on the plants. He set them up along the first 2 rows of beds with the practiced efficiency of a man who has assembled the same equipment in 15 different locations on 4 different celestial bodies. Then he got out the strawberries. They went in under the pink and white lamps in small biodegradable starter cups, the soil mixture he'd brought already loaded with the microbial cultures he'd been developing for the last 8 months. He was not strictly here for the strawberries. They were not the solution to the northern continent's nitrogen problem. They were not a commercial crop, and they had no place in a serious agricultural intervention report. He brought them because they were his, because they had come with him everywhere since his first posting at 24, and because, in his experience, the best way to understand a planet's relationship with growing things was to start with something you already knew how to read. He could tell more from a strawberry plant's response to new soil than from a month of laboratory analysis. He set the last cup in place. The greenhouse hummed. Outside, the bioluminescent canals pulsed quietly in colors he didn't have names for yet. He looked at the 12 small cups of soil with the expression of a man arriving, after a long journey, somewhere he intended to stay. "Right," he said, to no one in particular. "Let's see what you make of each other." She appeared on the 4th day, which was either a Thursday or a Friday depending on which calendar Eliot was using, and he had by that point given up trying to reconcile the two, and had simply started referring to all days as today, and all previous days as before today. A system that was philosophically sound if professionally inadvisable. He was crouched between the 2nd and 3rd row of experimental beds, taking soil samples with a hand probe and talking to the legumes, not because he expected a response, but because he had found, empirically, over 20 years of field work, that plants in new environments established better when they were spoken to, and he had long since stopped being embarrassed about it. When he became aware of a presence at the greenhouse entrance that was too still to be Corvith, who moved through doorways with the restless efficiency of a man, perpetually between appointments. He looked up. She was standing at the threshold with both hands clasped in front of her, a posture so formally correct that it suggested significant practice, and she was watching him with the focused, unreadable attention of someone who has found something unexpected and is deciding what category to put it in. She was small 8 or 9 by Eliot's rough estimation, though he had already learned that guessing Solvith ages from appearance was an exercise in creative fiction. Her skin held that faint iridescence he was beginning to know, though hers ran lighter than most, closer to the color of early morning than the deep silver blue of the court officials he'd been introduced to. Her eyes were pale amber, and they were, at this precise moment, fixed on the UV lamps with an expression caught somewhere between scientific curiosity and personal affront. Eliot straightened up. His knees made the sound they always made when he'd been crouching too long, a noise that he felt was unnecessarily editorial. The child's gaze moved from the lamps to him. She said something in Solvith, formal and careful, that his earpiece processed for a moment with the slight delay that meant it was working harder than usual, and then rendered as, "What are the red spherical nutrient nodes suspended from that vegetation?" Eliot looked at the strawberries. He looked back at her. "Strawberries," he said. "Want to try one?" He offered it the way he offered most things, without ceremony, without thinking particularly hard about whether ceremony was appropriate. A hand extended with a ripe berry resting in the palm the way you'd offer something to a careful animal or a curious child, both of whom, in his experience, responded better to the absence of fuss than to the presence of it. She looked at his hand. She looked at the strawberry. She stepped into the greenhouse with the deliberate precision of someone who has made a decision and committed to it fully, and she took it. The expression on her face when she ate it was one of the most purely evaluative things Eliot had ever seen. She was not performing enjoyment or performing suspicion. She was simply tasting it with complete attention, the way a person tastes something when they are genuinely trying to understand it. And for a moment she looked less like a child and more like someone who would, given time, be formidable. Then she said her name was Sira, in the same careful formal solvith, without offering anything else. "Eliot," he said, "I'm the one trying to figure out why your soil doesn't like wheat." She considered this. "Is that why you are speaking to the smaller plants?" "They're legumes, and yes, partly." He paused. "Also, I just find it helps." Sierra looked at the legumes with an expression that suggested she was reserving judgment. He showed her the UV lamps because she was already looking at them, and because explaining things to curious people was, for Eliot, as reflexive as breathing. He told her about the light spectrum, how different wavelengths did different jobs, how the pink was for flowering and the white was for leaf growth, how plants were essentially running a very slow and very complicated chemistry experiment using light as the power source. He tore a page from his field notebook and drew it out, the carbon cycle rendered in smudged pencil, CO2 arrows and glucose molecules, and a small drawing of a sun that was not his best work artistically, but was accurate. Sierra watched the drawing happen. She asked 11 questions. Not in a row, she waited between them, the way someone waits when they are actually processing the previous answer, rather than just cueing the next question, which in Eliot's experience of explaining things to people was rarer than it should have been. He answered all 11. On the third answer he sat down on an upturned equipment crate because the explanation required both hands to demonstrate properly. On the seventh answer Sierra sat down too, on the floor beside the strawberry beds without any apparent concern for her very clean and very complicated clothing, because the question had required her to look more closely at the root structure, and proximity was more practical than dignity. By the time they finished it was 2 hours later. Eliot had not noticed. He gave her a watering can, a real one, his own, the battered aluminum one he'd carried since Europa, and showed her the correct amount, which was less than people always assumed. There was a tendency, he explained, to overwater from kindness, which sounded like a reasonable impulse, but was in practice how you drowned things you were trying to help. Sierra absorbed this with a seriousness that suggested she understood it applied to more than plants. She watered the first row with a focus that was almost ceremonial. Then she stopped at one particular runner, a lateral shoot off the main strawberry plant that was doing rather well, reaching toward the nearest lamp with the botanical optimism of something that had decided it intended to thrive. "This one," she said, "I want to name this one." Eliot, who had been making notes on his tablet and had not looked up, said, "Go ahead." "Orvith," she said, "after Orvith the Unbroken." He was a general in the Fourth Expansion, who held a position for 31 days against superior numbers, because he refused to accept the tactical assessment. Eliot looked up from his tablet. He looked at the strawberry runner. He looked at Sierra. "That," he said, "is a lot of pressure to put on a plant." Sierra considered this with the gravity of an 8-year-old who has just been offered a perspective she had not previously considered. Then she said, "Orvith the general would have agreed. He did not enjoy pressure either. He simply did not have the option of avoiding it." Eliot laughed. It came out before he could have stopped it, which he wouldn't have anyway. It was the kind of laugh that a genuinely surprising thing produces, short and real and unperformed. Sierra went very still. Not alarmed, something more complicated than alarmed, the stillness of someone experiencing a small, private recalibration. Then slowly at the corners of her mouth, she smiled. It was, Eliot thought, the smile of someone who had not done it in a while and was remembering that it was allowed. He filed the observation away somewhere unremarkable and went back to his notes. Outside, the bioluminescent canals ran on in their slow, glowing rhythms, and the greenhouse hummed. And Orvith the strawberry runner reached incrementally toward the light, as runners do, with the patient certainty of something that has decided it belongs exactly where it is. Sierra came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that, until her presence in the greenhouse between the second and fourth hours of the morning cycle became as reliable as the UV lamps and considerably more conversational. She always arrived at the same time, always with the same formal posture at the threshold that she then abandoned entirely once she was inside, and she always went first to check on Orvith, with the focused attention of a general reviewing her own troops. Eliot had stopped questioning it after the third visit. He had a policy, developed over years of working in places where the social architecture was not always immediately legible, of not pulling on threads until he understood what the thread was attached to. Sierra was curious. She was careful. She learned fast and asked better questions every day, and she never touched anything in the greenhouse without asking first, which put her ahead of 3 of Eliot's former graduate assistants. Whatever her story was, it was not his business until it was, and until then he had nitrogen readings to interpret and a soil composition problem that was slowly beginning to make a particular kind of sense. It was on the 6th day that she told him about the tutors. She mentioned it sideways, the way children mention things that matter more than they want to show, embedded in a question about whether plants learn from experience, which was itself a real question that Eliot took seriously, explaining the difference between adaptation and memory while he recalibrated the humidity sensors. Sierra listened and then said without particular emphasis that her tutors did not explain things that way. Eliot adjusted a sensor bracket. What way do they explain things? Correctly, Sierra said. They explain things correctly. The information is accurate, I have checked. A pause, precise and considered, but they explain it like they are reading coordinates, like the point is to arrive at the fact and stop. Eliot thought about this. And you want to know what's around the fact. I want to know why the fact is shaped the way it is, Sierra said, with a clarity that made Eliot put down his calibration tool and look at her properly for a moment. She was examining Orvith's latest growth with a small handheld light she had started bringing from the 3rd day onward, a piece of equipment that looked considerably more sophisticated than anything Eliot had in his own kit. That's a nice scanner, he said. It is the standard Imperial Biological Assessment Instrument, Sierra said, in the tone of someone who has never considered whether their equipment is nice because it has simply always been there. Eliot decided, for the 14,000th time in his adult life, not to pull on that thread. The soil work was advancing. He had begun to build a picture of the northern continent's problem that was less about the soil itself and more about what had happened to its microbial architecture. Centuries of solvent agricultural practice had been, with the best intentions and considerable technological investment, comprehensively sterilizing the very biological networks that any introduced species needed to negotiate with in order to establish. The planet had its own systems, old and complex, and the solvent had been accidentally overriding them, with solutions that assumed the problem was chemical when it was fundamentally relational. It was, Eliot had written in his field notes at 2 in the morning 3 days ago, like trying to introduce someone to a city by replacing all the roads. He explained this to Sierra on the 8th day, not because it was relevant to her in any way he could identify, but because she was there and he was thinking about it, and she had by that point established, empirically, that she was a person who could follow a complicated idea if you gave it to her at the right pace. She sat on her customary patch of greenhouse floor and listened to the whole thing, and at the end she said, "So the previous consultants were solving the wrong problem." They were solving a real problem, Eliot said, with the professional fairness of a man who had once also been wrong about a soil system and preferred not to be righteous about other people's errors. Just not the one that needed solving first. Sierra considered this. My mother says that is the most common kind of mistake, solving the available problem instead of the actual one. Your mother sounds like someone worth listening to, Eliot said, absently, entering a data string into his tablet. Sierra looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Yes, she said after a moment. She is. On the 11th day, Corvith appeared at the greenhouse entrance during Sierra's visit for the first time. He stood there with the expression of a man who has arrived to do something routine and found the situation unexpectedly more textured than anticipated. He looked at Sierra. He looked at Eliot. He looked at Sierra again, with a quality of attention that was different from how he usually looked at things, sharper, and with something underneath it that Eliot would later identify as the specific alertness of someone watching a situation they understand better than the other people in it. He said nothing about Sierra. He delivered a routine update about Eliot's supply requisition and left. That evening, for the first time, Eliot noticed that the palace staff moved slightly differently around him. Not dramatically, nothing he could have named if asked directly. A fraction more attention in the hallways. A shade more care in how his dinner was presented. Small calibrations in the behavior of people who had previously treated him with the pleasant professional neutrality reserved for visiting specialists. He put it down to the fact that his soil analysis was progressing well, and that good work sometimes changed the temperature of a room. He was wrong about this, but he would not find out how wrong for another 4 days. On the 15th day, Sierra arrived carrying something wrapped in a piece of material that she held with both hands and considerable ceremony. She set it on the empty bench beside the UV station and unwrapped it to reveal a small pot, solveth-made, deep blue ceramic with a geometric pattern, documents with intent. She had the storm-colored eyes that Sierra had mentioned once, briefly, in the context of a conversation about solveth iris pigmentation that Eliot had steered toward the botanical, because he had not, at that point, understood why she was telling him. She looked at him with the measured assessment of someone who has been given a situation and is deciding how much of her actual reaction to let onto her face. She let on, very little. She was good at this. You are Eliot Vance, she said, which was not technically a question. I am, he said. I would shake your hand, but I've been in a soil core. Something moved briefly across her expression, not quite amusement. The ghost of a consideration of amusement. I am aware of who you are, she said. I am Myron. I am the Queen. I have brought my legal counsel because what I need to tell you has legal dimensions that I am not qualified to represent without them, and I have found that delivering this kind of news without documentation leads to disputes about what was actually said. Eliot put down the soil core. He pulled off his work gloves. He looked at the 4 legal professionals and their documents and the Queen's expression, which had settled into something he could now identify as the look of a person who has rehearsed a conversation, found all versions of it inadequate, and decided to simply proceed. He said, "Is this about Sierra?" "It is substantially about Sierra," the Queen said, "and about a body of constitutional law that I have personally found unreasonable on 3 separate previous occasions, and have been unable to amend because amending it requires a supermajority of the Imperial Council, who find it charming." She sat down, uninvited, on the equipment crate that had become Sierra's customary seat, with the ease of a woman who does not require invitation to sit in rooms within her own empire. The senior legal advisor, a narrow-faced Solveth man whose iridescence ran a particularly formal shade of gold, opened a document and began to explain. The explanation took 20 minutes. Eliot listened to all of it. He asked 4 clarifying questions, each of which the legal advisor answered with the careful precision of someone who had anticipated them. At the end, he sat very still for a moment and looked at the strawberry beds, where Orvith was doing extremely well in his new ceramic pot, reaching toward the UV lamp with the particular confidence of a plant that had decided its situation was acceptable and intended to make the most of it. "So," Eliot said slowly, "because Sierra laughed with me and came back and named a plant." The declaration of worthiness was confirmed by Palace monitoring at 14 distinct logged instances, the legal advisor said. "The attachment is genuine, voluntary, and public. The protocols are unambiguous." "Your palace," Eliot said, "has been logging my strawberry plants." "The palace monitors all significant threshold events," the legal advisor said, with the tone of a man who monitors threshold events and finds the practice entirely reasonable. Eliot looked at the Queen. The Queen looked at him. There was a moment between them that was composed entirely of two people recognizing, across a considerable cultural distance, the specific absurdity of their shared situation. A moment that did not fix anything, but that made the room feel slightly less like a deposition. "I want to be clear," Eliot said, "that I was teaching her about photosynthesis." "I know," Myron said. "I did not know who she was." "I know that also. I gave her a watering can." "The watering can," the legal advisor noted, consulting his document, "is logged as a formal instrument of trust bestowal under subsection 9, paragraph." "Thank you," the Queen said, and the legal advisor stopped. She looked at Eliot with the directness of someone who has governed for 11 years and has learned that the most efficient path through a difficult conversation is usually the honest one. She told him that the marriage would not need to be what the word suggested to him. It was constitutional architecture, not personal arrangement. He would keep his work, his greenhouse, his consultancy role, which had, she said this with a dryness that was the closest thing to humor he'd seen from her yet, produced more progress in 15 days than 7 previous consultants had managed in 4 years combined. He would receive a title. He would receive quarters in the palace residential wing. He would, critically, have continued access to Sierra, because that was the point of the law, the original and actual point, and the law was at least honest about what it was trying to protect. And Sierra, Myron said, had already informed the kitchen staff of his dietary preferences. Eliot absorbed this. He thought about his apartment on Earth with its leaking tap, and its accumulated evidence of a life lived in transit. The boxes that had never been unpacked because he was always leaving again, the empty walls, the coffee mug that was the only ceramic thing he owned that wasn't fieldwork equipment. He thought about a 9-year-old girl who researched drainage aperture ratios and named plants after generals. He thought about what it meant that the loneliest he had felt in recent memory was the evenings when Sierra didn't visit, and that he had been not examining that thought carefully because careful examination of thoughts like that tended to lead somewhere. He looked at the Queen. He said, "Can I have time to think?" 14 days, she said. "The protocols allow 14 days. Then she stood, straightening with the composed efficiency of a woman returning to a day that contained 17 other items of governance, and she paused at the greenhouse entrance, the same threshold where Sierra always paused. He noticed the same brief stillness before committing to a room, and she said, without turning around, "For what it is worth, she has not laughed like that with anyone in a long time." She left. The legal team followed, with their documents and their formal gold iridescence and their logged threshold events. The greenhouse hummed back into its ordinary register. Eliot stood alone among the grow lamps and the soil beds and the experimental legumes, and he looked at Orvith in his blue ceramic pot, reaching toward the light